All right, this presentation is on the topic of racism and white privilege. As I mentioned in the introduction video for this week, this is a really difficult topic for many people to discuss. We're not really socialized in the United States to engage in these uncomfortable conversations about racial inequality and the racism that still largely affects our society today. However, given the recent current events, the protests occurring in Minneapolis and throughout the United States over the past few months, extending in the Black Lives Matter movement, America is kind of at this turning point that we haven't seen since the civil rights movements in the nearly 50, 60 years ago, where people are really being called to engage in these uncomfortable conversations about racism and to actively work to address this social problem. So this is a very timely subject to talk about, and it's one of the most pervasive social problems that impacts our society today. So as I have done throughout this course, I'm definitely going to encourage you to try and approach this sensitive topic with an open mind. I'm going to strongly encourage you to lean into these uncomfortable conversations that we're having. And especially for people who are white or people who pass as white, if you have fair skin, I'm going to extra encourage you to take down your defensive barriers. It's not easy for us white people to acknowledge the white privilege that we have. And it's not easy for us white people to understand how there's a difference between simply not being racist and being anti-racist. And if we want to see positive social change in our society, we need white people to become anti-racist and not just ignorant that this is not a social problem that exists. All right, so with that in mind, let's start by just introducing these terms of race and ethnicity. Oftentimes they're used interchangeably by people, but they refer to different things. So a race refers to a group of people that share distinct physical characteristics that society thinks are important and oftentimes biological. And I put the quotation marks around biological there because, as we'll talk about here today, there really is nothing inherently biological about race, which maybe sounds very weird to some of you, but I'll explain that in just a few minutes here. So an ethnic group or ethnicity refers to a group of people that share cultural or national heritage, okay? So race and ethnicity, like I said, are not the same thing. Unlike race, which is based on observable physical traits, ethnicities are not, okay? So for example, two people of the same race may have very different ethnicities, while two people of the same ethnicity may be of different races. For example, a white Irish person versus a white South African person. In this context, white refers to the racial category, and Irish or South African refer to ethnicity. At the same time, we could have a black British person versus an Asian British person. So in this context, two different races, one person being black, the other person being Asian, but they have the same ethnicity, being British. Okay. Another good example of this, Cameron Diaz, the actress featured on the top here, and Rosario Dawson, the actress on the bottom, are both technically Hispanic Cuban Americans. However, Cameron Diaz is white and Dawson is African American or black. All right, so race and ethnicity don't refer to the same thing. It's possible for people to share an ethnicity but of different races, just as it's possible for people to have the same race, but different ethnicities. It really just depends on the person. So it's important to know what we're talking about here. So is race biological or a social construction of reality? This is a very sociologically informed question. And from the science of sociology, we make the argument that race is not biological. It is indeed something that we as a society socially construct. So if you remember, social constructions of reality simply refer to behaviors, ideas, or social phenomenon that we as a society create. We give meaning to them, right? So very much rooted in the symbolic interactionist realm of sociological theory here, this idea of social construction. the meanings that we attach to things or to symbols in our society carry very heavy weight, because that's how we communicate and make sense of things. And race is something, it's a symbol that we have created in our society. It's a socially constructed aspect of our society. So how do I mean that race is something socially constructed? Isn't it biological, because people are born with a skin tone, right? If you're born with it, you're not in control of what color your skin is in that regard. So how can race not be something that's biological? Well, it's socially constructed because the physical distinctions that we as a society use to categorize people into quote-unquote different races are socially agreed upon characteristics, right? We as a society decided that we were going to use a person's skin tone, their color of their skin, to determine what race we would categorize them in, and then subsequently how they would be treated by society. So for instance, we could have just as easily as a society decided that instead of referring to skin tone to group people into different racial categories, we could use hair color or eye color or height. We could have used any different physical or biological characteristic of our body to categorize people into different racial categories. But we decided as a society that we were going to use skin tone. And if you're wondering why we made that decision, it largely stems from a conflict theorist perspective of this idea of power, right? White colonists, predominantly from Europe, that settled in different areas throughout the world, used their white skin as a feature to claim their superiority over other people, predominantly people that had skin tones of different colors or darker hues. So this is an idea that was socially constructed, this idea of grouping people into different categories based off the color of their skin, and then affording certain privileges or power to certain groups, predominantly white groups, and marginalizing and oppressing people of color as a result. It's also important to note that definitions of what a race is and how we categorize people into different racial categories have changed a lot throughout history, which is further evidence that they are socially constructed. Skin color is not inherently meaningful, but it is given meaning based on social classifications, right? So there's nothing that makes one certain shade of skin better or worse than the other. It's the socially constructed meanings that we attach to different skin tones that have very profound consequences on our lived experiences as humans in any given society. Race helps to solidify power dynamics in the United States. The U.S. was built on racism. The U.S. was built on the institution of slavery, which treated indigenous black and brown bodies as property rather than as human beings. And that can sound really disgusting. It should sound really disgusting because it is. But the unfortunate reality is that when slavery was abolished, it did not mean that racism was also abolished. In fact, many scholars argue, and we'll talk more about this in the other section within this week that's dealing more with crime and mass incarceration in the United States, many scholars argue that our current prison system is actually just an extension of slavery. It's modern day slavery, and we'll talk more about that in the next section here. While human racial groups are not biological categories, race is a social reality as a way of structuring societies and experiencing the world is very real. This is a quote that came from the American Association of Physical Anthropology's, their statement on race and racism. So again, this is just to note that saying that race is not biological, that it is rather socially constructed, is a really widely shared and agreed upon statement across many different bodies of science in the social sciences. So another great way that I said we can make evidence that race is something that's socially constructed is just by looking at how race has been defined differently throughout history, right? So a really interesting exercise is to look at how the U.S. Census, right? So every 10 years, the United States conducts a census where we get demographic information about the overall population, right, of the U.S. And since the first census was conducted in 1790, you can see that there were only two racial categories on the first census. You were either white or you were other, right? So anyone who was not white was automatically classified in other, and other was the racial category that everyone who was Black or Latino or Native American or Asian American, etc., would have been categorized in. Fast forward to the year 1900, you see we now have different racial categories on the census. You could be white, black, Chinese, Japanese, or Indian, which refer to Native Americans. 1910, it changed again. White, black, mulatto, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, other. 1930, it changed again. White, Negro, Mexican, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Hindu, Korean, other. And now currently here in 2010, we have white, black, African American or Negro, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, or some other race. So look at how race has been defined and categorized and how that's shifted throughout history, right? It's really interesting to see how we as a society socially construct race and define different racial categories in different ways throughout time. It's also interesting to note that up until 1950, it was actually the job of the census enumerator, so the person that would go door to door and ask how many people are living in your home and etc. to keep tally on the census. It was actually that person's job to categorize the person that they were talking to into a racial group, right? So that's really interesting, right? The enumerators didn't even ask people what their race was. They would just go up, look at them. Oh, this person looks white. I'm going to check them off as white. Or this person looks like they might be Native American. I'm going to check them off as Native American. So that's another really sociologically interesting factor about race here, is that it really doesn't matter how we self-identify what our race actually is. How we get treated in society really depends on how other people perceive us. This idea, if you've ever heard the saying, perception is reality, that's really an important concept here in sociology, because it is. How other people perceive us, how other people view our race, affects how we're treated. Now, I am white, but I do have a relatively kind of like tan natural skin tone. And in the summertime, especially if I spend a lot of time outdoors, if I get a lot of sunlight, my skin does get pretty dark. And I've worked in a restaurant industry for a decade when I was in college. And I grew up in the Midwest where it was predominantly white. So I would have a lot of little old white ladies. It was always little old white ladies sitting at my tables. They'd say, "Wow, what's your ethnicity? What race are you? Your skin is so dark to be up here in North Dakota." And I would just be taken aback that someone would, have the audacity to ask what my race was, because I looked different than what they did, right? Now, of course, I'm still white and I still access a lot of white privilege, but at times when my skin gets to its darkest point, I do experience in some kind of third degree type of way what it is like to experience being other, because your skin looks different than what is normative in that particular geographic region. I think it's also really interesting to consider how race and how one was being determined as being black or a person of color has shifted throughout time. The way people are categorized into races has changed significantly throughout history. The socially constructed criteria used to define people as white or black today are very different than what they were in the past. You may remember from your history classes in high school that the U.S. used to practice what was called one-drop rule, which mean that if you were a person that had any lineage at all that connected you to being a person of color, an African American, you were classified as black. So maybe I had a great-great-great-grandparent that they could trace back to being African American. I too, according to the one-drop rule then, would have been classified and treated as an African American, even if my skin looked just as white as people that had pure white lineage. It's also interesting to note that in the early 1900s, there were several different ethnic groups that were white-skinned, for example, Irish and Italian people, but they were not considered white. They were actually treated as people of color. So this is a sign that from the early 1900s here in the United States that some business owner posted on their business outside. It says, "No Irish, no blacks, no dogs." So interesting to see that even people that were categorized as that looked white were treated as a minority or othered because their ethnicity was not considered to be pure as it in comparison to English settlers in the United States instead of being Irish, right? So just an interesting context to provide some evidence that race, again, is a social construction of reality, and this understanding that race is something that we as humans construct is a really important building block to understand how racism is also something that we as human beings give meaning to.